Let's go Broncos! Something very interesting is happening inside the Denver Broncos organization right before mandatory minicamp, and the deeper you look into it, the more it feels like multiple storylines are beginning to collide at exactly the same time. Because on the surface, fans are talking about a new signing. They're talking about roster battles. They're talking about young players trying to earn opportunities. But underneath all of that, there may be a much bigger story developing. A story about competition. A story about opportunity. And a story about several Broncos players who suddenly find themselves with a chance to dramatically change their standing inside this football team. The timing couldn't be more important. Mandatory minicamp is here. Training camp is getting closer. Roster spots are becoming more valuable. And every single practice rep matters more than ever. That's why today's developments deserve attention. Because one recent signing may have quietly created pressure inside one of the most crowded position groups on the roster. A young pass rusher continues generating serious excitement from people inside the organization. And perhaps most fascinating of all, Denver's new offensive coordinator may have just given fans the clearest indication yet about what this offense could look like moving forward. And trust me, if those clues are accurate, Broncos fans have plenty of reasons to be excited. Before we go any further, make sure you've already hit the like button if you believe the Broncos are building something special this season. And I want every optimistic Broncos fan watching right now to comment, "Go Broncos! The future is brighter than ever." Personally, I think this is one of the most important periods of the entire offseason. Not because games are being played, but because this is when coaches start discovering who deserves bigger opportunities. This is when unexpected players emerge. This is when roster battles become real. And based on everything we're hearing right now, several Broncos players may be positioning themselves to become much bigger stories before training camp even arrives. Let's start with the name that suddenly is Broncos country talking, Hakeem Butler. Because while some fans may view this as a simple depth addition, the reality may be much more interesting than that. According to the information discussed, Butler arrives in Denver after establishing himself as one of the most productive players in the UFL. His production with the St. Louis Battlehawks was impossible to ignore, and his physical profile immediately stands out. At 6'5" and roughly 240 pounds, he brings the type of size that naturally creates intrigue whenever a coaching staff decides to take a closer look. But here's where the story gets fascinating. This isn't necessarily about Butler making the roster tomorrow. This is about competition. The Broncos currently have a crowded wide receiver room. There are more players competing than available spots. And whenever a new player enters that environment, somebody else immediately feels pressure. That's exactly why this signing is generating attention. Because if there is truly one receiver position still available, the competition for that role could become one of the most intense battles of the entire offseason. And the more you examine the situation, the more you realize that Denver may have intentionally created this competition. Not because they're dissatisfied, not because they're desperate, but because good organizations constantly force players to earn their spots. No guarantees, no shortcuts, no assumptions, just competition. And honestly, that's exactly what fans should want to see. The Broncos appear committed to creating an environment where the best players rise to the top. And if Butler performs well enough, he could make things very interesting over the next several weeks. But while the wide receiver battle is heating up, another storyline may be even more important. Because there is one young defender whose name keeps coming up again and again. And the confidence surrounding him continues to grow. That player is Q Robinson. And based on everything being discussed, there are people inside the organization who believe his future could be extremely bright. In fact, some of the comments highlighted in the report suggest that Robinson has already shown signs of being a future starter. Think about that for a moment. Future starter. That's not praise that gets handed out casually. That's the type of praise that reflects genuine belief. And if Robinson continues developing, he could become one of the most important young players on the Broncos roster. Especially considering the uncertainty currently surrounding the edge position. The discussion repeatedly pointed toward Robinson's athletic traits, versatility, special teams value, and upside as reasons for optimism. And perhaps most importantly, there appears to be a belief that his best football is still ahead of him. That's exactly the kind of player every team hopes to discover. A player who isn't just contributing today, but a player who could become significantly more important tomorrow. And that's where this discussion starts becoming really exciting for Broncos fans. Because while Hakeem Butler and Q Robinson are grabbing headlines, the most important long-term development may actually involve the Broncos offense. Specifically, Davis Webb. According to the discussion, Webb offered his first significant comments as offensive coordinator, and while he understandably didn't reveal every detail, there were some very interesting clues about how he plans to approach this opportunity. What stood out wasn't a specific play. It wasn't a specific formation. It was a philosophy. Adaptability. The willingness to evolve. The willingness to borrow ideas from successful offenses around the league and apply them in ways that fit your own personnel. And honestly, that's exactly what the best offensive minds do. They don't become trapped by one system. They don't force players into roles that don't fit. They identify strengths. They identify advantages. And then they build around them. The discussion specifically referenced the Los Angeles Rams as an example of an offense that evolved throughout the season. According to the comments being discussed, Webb appears interested in studying successful concepts and understanding why they work rather than simply copying them. That's an important distinction, because the goal isn't to become another team. The goal is to become the best version of the Denver Broncos. And if Webb can successfully blend different ideas into a system that maximizes the talent already on the roster, the offense could become much more dangerous than many people expect. What I find particularly intriguing is how all these stories connect. Think about it. The Broncos are adding competition at wide receiver. They're developing young pass rushers. They're evaluating depth throughout the roster. And at the same time, the offensive coaching staff is exploring ways to create more flexibility and more explosive opportunities. That's not a coincidence. That's roster building. That's organizational planning. That's a team trying to find every possible advantage before the season begins. Another point that shouldn't be overlooked is the discussion surrounding personnel packages. The report suggested that Denver could potentially utilize a wider variety of personnel groupings moving forward depending on matchups and available talent. That may not sound dramatic at first, but it can completely change how defenses prepare for an offense. Because the more variables an offense presents, the harder it becomes to defend. Different formations, different alignments, different personnel combinations. All of it forces opponents to spend more time preparing and less time attacking. And that's exactly what creative offensive coordinators want. Personally, my biggest takeaway from this entire report is simple. The Broncos appear to be entering mandatory minicamp with more competition, more flexibility, and more intriguing storylines than they've had in quite some time. Nothing is guaranteed. Nobody has won a job yet. And that's exactly why the next few weeks matter so much. Hakeem Butler still has to prove himself. Q Robinson still has to continue developing. Davis Webb still has to translate ideas into production. But the opportunity is there. And sometimes opportunity is where the biggest offseason stories begin. The closer we get to training camp, the more clarity we'll have. We'll find out who rises. We'll find out who earns bigger roles. We'll find out which competitions were real and which ones were only offseason speculation. And I have a feeling at least one of these storylines is going to surprise a lot of people. Because every year there are players who force their way into the conversation. Every year there are unexpected contributors. Every year there are coaches who unveil ideas nobody saw coming. And right now, the Broncos appear to have all three possibilities sitting right in front of them. So Broncos country, here's the question I want you to answer. Which storyline are you watching most closely as mandatory minicamp begins? Hakeem Butler's push for a roster spot? Q Robinson's chance to become a major contributor? Or Davis Webb's effort to reshape the Broncos offense? Let me know in the comments below because I think the answers to those questions could tell us a lot about what this team will look like.